This picture was taken on November 17th, 1963, outside of St. Anne's Catholic Church in downtown West Palm Beach. Unfortunately, 5 days later, President Kennedy would be assassinated. This was during an era when the Cold War gripped our nation. 58 years later, to the date, I attended St. Anne's Catholic Church with my son, where we are parishioners. As we pulled into the parking lot, I noticed on a sunny day without any rain, the street was flooded with salt water. It was the king tide season. And after we came out of church, this water was completely gone. Today, 58 years after President Kennedy walked these grounds, we are faced with an existential crisis of climate change and global warming. And the question is, how can we address these issues? How can we transform our streets to save our planet, to address climate change? I'm Professor John Renne from Florida Atlantic University. I direct the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions, and I'm excited to share with you a bit about my new book with my colleague, Professor Billy Fields, on adaptation urbanism and resilient communities, transforming streets to address climate change. In this book, we highlight case studies from Europe in Copenhagen, Rotterdam, London, as well as New Orleans and Miami. We make the case that bouncing back is not enough. We cannot just design our infrastructure to be able to withstand climate change and the disasters that come with it, including hurricanes, flooding, wildfires. We need to adapt our infrastructure and solve the climate change problems. That's what's at the heart of adaptation urbanism. We need to bounce forward. We need to integrate adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, climate mitigation, cleaning up the environment. Adaptation urbanism, our book, incorporates 4 areas, including sustainable transportation, compact development, incorporating blue-green infrastructure, and doing this in an equitable way. We focus on climate adaptation and mitigation as a framework for how our cities and communities can bounce forward in the age of climate change. This is an example of a street in Rotterdam, which was part of our case study. Streets in Europe did not always look like this. In fact, in the past, they were dominated by automobiles in a very similar way that we see here in the United States. They have adapted their streets to turn them over to people and to landscape and to the environment, park space, places to channel the water into canals that are not buried underground, green medians, bricks, places for cyclists. And this does not exclude automobiles, but it de-emphasizes the automobile as the only mode of transportation that we see in many of our suburban communities, including South Florida. Our book explores how climate adaptation and mitigation aren't being used for resilience planning for streets. We evaluate resilience plans in each of the cities, and we look at placing emphasis on how we can re-emerge streets into the concept of a resilient street or a resilient district. This is an example of a change that occurred in recent years in Copenhagen. This is a plaza not far from central Copenhagen, but a little bit out in the suburban inner ring area of the city, but still very much in the city, that in 2009 looked like a very typical asphalt plaza. This now today has been uncovered, as you see in the image below, with a water square that can accept heavy downpour rainfall. Even in Copenhagen, they are experiencing flash flooding events known as cloudbursts. They have designed the street to be a very relaxing environment where people can enjoy nature. They have replaced the asphalt with brick pavers, public art, and a lot of greenery, and the engineering to be able to retain this water without flooding these homes. So we believe that seeing is believing. And if you don't have the ability to go into church and see a street flooded with a king tide, and to come back out and to see that water have completely disappeared, we are at FAU in my center embracing technology. We're using virtual reality as a way to be able to get the public to see this firsthand. VR is affordable, it's portable, and it's easy to use with the public. We did a model on Las Olas Boulevard in Fort Lauderdale, which is kind of the main dining street in downtown Fort Lauderdale. And we took the US Army Corps of Engineers model for what the high tide would look like in the year 2100. We showed people maps. And of course, most folks in our community can't really understand what a map really means. We turned it into a VR model, and we showed an image like this, where people can see what the models are showing the street may look like in just about 80 years from now. We also replicated this experiment in Honolulu, where we showed people these maps, and then we showed them a VR model, an animated model of what it looks like with water up to your knees in the same location. And these were with folks who were stakeholders, business owners and residents in that area. And what we found was that 95% of the people who saw the VR, they stated that other people in their community would benefit from that simulation. The level of comprehension was incredible. Genuinely, seeing is believing. When you see a map or read a chart, which most people can't understand, they don't really quite grasp the threat. But when you show them an animated VR model, they really can understand it. This right here is a hyper realistic model that a company called Virtual Planet Technologies has developed. We are partnering with them and a researcher from the Virtual Reality Lab from Stanford University. And we're going to be developing a model like this to be able to engage with the community in West Palm Beach to look at what the flooding will look like in 80 years into the future. And then we could utilize this to come up with adaptation strategies such as seawalls, vegetative walls, vegetative coastlines, all sorts of different techniques to figure out what the community may like to see. And using these technologies to garner public input will allow us to better figure out what solutions are most desirable by the community looking at this magic crystal ball into the future. But like I said at the beginning, adapting our infrastructure by building walls and building different types of mechanisms is not going to solve our problem. We not only need to adapt our infrastructure to withstand greater climate change threats, like I'm saying, we do need to do that. We do need to adapt and protect our infrastructure. Now, that is complicated in the South Florida context when our bedrock is on limestone. Can't necessarily always build a seawall because water can seep right underneath that seawall, coming under that because of the limestone bedrock. But there are strategies and solutions that we need to consider, including where we direct future development, how we may at some point in the future might need to abandon certain locations and encourage development on higher ground in other locations. But as a country, we just passed the largest infrastructure bill in our nation's history. And as I noted earlier, we need to use funding to encourage people to get out of their vehicles. Now, $110 billion of the funding is going to be directed to roads and bridges. This is the maintenance. This is the C- grade that the Engineering Society has given our nation's infrastructure, and we need to repair that. But when we look at the bill, we see the lion's share still is continuing to go into an automobile system. 66 billion will go into passenger and freight. 39 billion will go into public transit, and only 15 billion will go into electric vehicles. 50 billion, fortunately, will go into climate change protection. But the question that I ask you is that if we do not revamp our entire transportation system to get people out of cars, to stop generating carbon emissions, to create the kinds of streets that we see in Rotterdam, in Copenhagen, and in other places in Europe that are very progressive, if we can't get people to use zero carbon emitting modes like walking and cycling, and modes that emit significantly less carbon dioxide like public transit and rail, and electric vehicles, which can be charged through solar power. If we're not making these investments, which clearly we're not, are we continuing down the same old path that we have always been on? Because adaptation urbanism, our book, is about trying to learn the lessons from the case studies where they are making radical differences. Now, our country may not all experience sea level rise impacts as we, people across our country generally will not experience those in the same way that we're going to experience that here in South Florida. Certainly people in the West are experiencing wildfires. We're experiencing the threat of major hurricanes. However, we are the canary in the coal mine here in South Florida. We need to get our act together. We need to develop a strategy as to where we direct future development to high ground. It needs to be done in an equitable way. We cannot displace the poor and marginalized communities that have historically been displaced. So we need to think about adaptation urbanism. We need to think about sustainable transport. We need to think about compact development. We need to think about revamping our infrastructure and making future investments to get people out of their cars and to get them walking, cycling, and enjoying nature on their streets. No different than people today are enjoying themselves in Copenhagen, Rotterdam, and across many places that we visited in Northern Europe. So I want to thank you, and I hope we can figure out a solution to take South Florida to the next level.